George had always been a man of simple needs and quiet pride. Throughout his life, he worked hard and sacrificed much, dedicating himself to building a future for his only son, Michael. George had raised Michael single-handedly, and every waking hour of his life had been spent ensuring that Michael would have the opportunities he himself had never known. George had once dreamt of starting his own business, of doing something more with his life, but he put all those dreams aside the moment Michael was born. Instead, he worked long hours at a job that paid little and demanded a lot, coming home exhausted but content, knowing he was doing it all for his son. Michael grew up watching his father's quiet determination, but as he got older, he began to see it less as a strength and more as something that held them back. Unlike his father, Michael was ambitious and driven by a hunger for success. He studied hard, made his way through college, and climbed the corporate ladder with the same grit his father had shown him. But as he rose in the world, Michael began to drift away from the life his father had known. He found himself embarrassed by George's humble ways, by his father's insistence on saving even the smallest amounts, and wearing clothes until they were worn thin. Michael wanted more wealth, more respect, more comfort. And the faster he ran toward his dreams, the less he thought about the sacrifices George had made to get him there. George, however, never let go of his son. To him, Michael was his pride, his heart. Even as Michael became more distant, George celebrated each of his son's achievements quietly, hanging onto newspaper clippings of Michael's awards or watching recordings of his corporate speeches. Though they spoke less and less, George would call Michael every week just to check in, to hear his voice, and to tell him how proud he was. But those calls were often cut short, with Michael always seeming to be in a rush, his voice polite but distant, his responses brief. George didn't push, though. He thought maybe this was just the way things were now, that it was normal for children to grow apart as they made lives of their own. But as time went on, George's health began to decline. What started as small aches and tiredness grew into days when he struggled to even get out of bed. His hands shook when he tried to do even the simplest tasks, and he grew weaker with each passing month. He tried to manage on his own, not wanting to worry Michael. For years, he had been the one to protect and care for his son, and he didn't want to burden Michael now. But the loneliness and the helplessness began to eat away at him. He would sit by the window, watching the seasons change, hoping that maybe one day Michael would visit or call with something more than hurried words. When Michael did visit, it was usually out of a sense of duty. He would bring groceries, spend a few minutes asking about George's health, and then leave with a distracted air, already focused on his next appointment. George never complained. Instead, he'd smile and tell Michael how proud he was, as he always had. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that his son saw him as a burden, something to be taken care of quickly, and then forgotten. One evening, George felt his heart grow heavy with a pain he couldn't ignore. He sat alone in his small, dimly lit kitchen, looking around at the familiar walls that had once been filled with laughter and life. He remembered Michael as a boy, running around the house, his laughter echoing in every corner. The silence now felt like an emptiness he couldn't escape. He found himself staring at an old photograph of them together, back when Michael was still young, when he used to look at George with admiration and joy. Those days felt like another lifetime. After a long, sleepless night, George made a difficult decision. He knew he couldn't keep hiding his struggles from Michael. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed his son's number. When Michael answered, George tried to keep his voice steady, but the weakness crept in, slipping through his words. He told Michael about his health, about the struggles he'd been facing, hoping that his son might understand. But as he spoke, he heard the impatience in Michael's voice, the subtle sighs and the long pauses. And when George finally asked if he could move in with Michael for a while, just until he got back on his feet, there was a silence on the other end that felt like a blow to his heart. Michael finally responded, his voice measured and controlled. He told George that he thought it would be better for both of them if George went to a nursing home, where he would have constant care and wouldn't have to rely on anyone. Michael assured him that it was for his own good, that the nursing home would provide everything he needed, and that he would visit him regularly. But George could hear the finality in his son's tone. The way Michael's words sounded more like a business decision than an act of love. George sat there, holding the phone in his hand, long after Michael had hung up, feeling a wave of sadness wash over him. It wasn't just the idea of leaving his home, the place he had built with his own hands. It was the realization that the son he had raised, the boy he had loved with all his heart, no longer felt the same love in return. The days leading up to George's move felt like a blur. He moved through each one in a daze, going through his belongings with a heavy heart, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Every item in his small, humble home seemed to hold a memory. There were the worn-out shoes he'd bought for Michael's graduation, the faded blanket his wife had crocheted before she passed, and the family photos he'd carefully framed and arranged on the walls. These things were pieces of his life, fragments of a past filled with love, sacrifice, and the hope that he had raised his son well. As he packed, he couldn't help but think of the future he had once dreamed of, where he'd spend his old age surrounded by family, with Michael visiting often, and maybe even bringing along grandchildren someday. It was a dream that now seemed distant, almost foolish in its innocence. He held on to one last photo, a picture of him and Michael on a fishing trip, both of them smiling, arms around each other. He packed it carefully, tucking it into the pocket of his coat. On the day of the move, Michael arrived, looking polished and put together, his suit crisp and his expression impassive. He helped George gather the last of his things, loading them into the car, with an efficiency that felt more like a task being completed than a heartfelt goodbye. George noticed the hurried way Michael glanced at his watch, the subtle impatience in his gestures, and it only deepened the ache in his heart. The drive to the nursing home was silent. George gazed out the window, watching as the familiar streets he had walked for years blurred by, each one a reminder of a life he was leaving behind. He wanted to say something, to reach out to his son, but he found that he couldn't. The words felt trapped, caught somewhere between his pride and his grief. When they arrived, George looked up at the building with a mix of dread and resignation. It was clean and well kept, with neatly trimmed hedges and friendly staff who greeted him warmly. But it felt cold, like a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. Michael helped him carry his things inside, barely glancing around, as though he was already mentally checking this task off his list. A nurse came over to greet George, introducing herself and explaining the daily routine at the nursing home, the meals and the activities. She was kind and patient, but to George it all felt like a script, rehearsed and impersonal. Michael stayed only a short while, long enough to make sure the paperwork was complete and that George was settled into his room. The room itself was small, just a bed, a chair, and a window, with a view of the courtyard below. It was clean and simple, but it lacked the warmth of home, the personal touches that had made his own house feel like his. George placed the photograph of him and Michael on the small bedside table, a last piece of familiarity in this unfamiliar place. Before leaving, Michael stood awkwardly at the doorway, glancing at his father with an expression that was hard to read. George could sense the discomfort, the way Michael seemed eager to leave but unwilling to say goodbye too quickly. George managed a small smile, his voice steady as he said, "Thank you, Michael. I appreciate everything you've done." Michael nodded, giving a brief smile in return. "It's for the best, Dad. You'll be well taken care of here, and I'll come visit when I can." The words were polite, but they felt hollow, like something he had rehearsed in his mind to ease his own guilt. George nodded, his smile fading as he watched Michael leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. He sat on the edge of his bed, looking around the room that would be his new home, feeling a loneliness deeper than he had ever known. He felt like a burden that had finally been lifted from his son's shoulders, left here to be cared for by strangers while Michael went on with his life. The days that followed were quiet, blending into each other in a way that made time feel like it was standing still. George made an effort to adjust, participating in the activities the nursing home offered, trying to get to know the other residents. Many of them had similar stories: children who were too busy, families who lived too far away. They were all kind, each one finding solace in the company of those who understood their struggles. But George still felt a lingering emptiness. He missed his son's voice, his home, the life he had once known. Each day, he would sit by the window, watching the world go by outside, wondering if Michael would visit, if he even thought of him anymore. The photo of them on the fishing trip became his comfort, a small reminder of a time when things had been simpler, when he and Michael had been close. He would hold it, tracing the edges with his fingers, wishing he could go back to those days. But the visits never came. Michael would call the nursing home occasionally to check on his father, speaking briefly to the nurses, but he never spoke to George directly. The few times George tried to call him, his calls went unanswered, or he was told that Michael was in a meeting, too busy to talk. George stopped trying after a while, realizing that he was now just a voice from the past, an obligation that Michael had moved on from. And so, George settled into the quiet of his new life, surrounded by the laughter and stories of the other residents, but feeling more alone than ever. The hope he'd once held on to, that Michael would come back, that they could reconnect, began to fade, replaced by a resignation that this was how things would be. As the weeks turned into months, George grew accustomed to the routines of the nursing home, though he never fully felt at ease. He made friends among the other residents, sharing meals, conversations, and the occasional game of cards. But despite their companionship, there was a loneliness that clung to him, a quiet sorrow that lingered in the background of each day. The other residents were friendly, yet he could sense that they too carried their own burdens of abandonment, families who had gradually drifted away or grown too busy to remember them. Every morning, George would sit by the window in his small room, his gaze fixed on the world outside. He would watch as the sunlight moved across the courtyard, wondering if Michael thought of him at all, if his son even knew how much he missed him. He held on to a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, Michael would come to visit, even if only for a brief moment. But as the days continued to pass without a word from his son, that hope slowly began to wither. One morning, George was startled from his thoughts by a gentle knock on his door. It was one of the nurses, a kind woman named Linda, who had always treated him with respect and care. She entered the room with a warm smile, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Mr. Bennett, this arrived for you," she said, handing him the package. George looked at it in surprise, his heart fluttering with a mixture of curiosity and longing. It had been so long since he'd received anything from the outside world. He hesitated, staring at the package as though it were a message from a past life. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple leather-bound notebook and an envelope with his name written in Michael's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The letter was short, with words that felt both rushed and distant. "Dad, I thought you might appreciate this journal. I know you have plenty of time now, so maybe you could write about the old days or whatever you like. Take care of yourself. Michael." George read the words over and over, feeling the emptiness within them. It was a gesture, but it felt like more of a duty than a heartfelt message. Still, he clung to it, imagining that maybe, just maybe, there was some small sliver of love behind Michael's words. He held the notebook close, feeling the leather's worn softness under his fingers, and decided he would use it to write down the memories he held closest to his heart. In the days that followed, George began to fill the pages with stories from his past. He wrote about Michael's childhood, about the little moments he had cherished, like teaching him to ride a bike, their camping trips, and the bedtime stories he used to read. Each memory was a small spark of warmth in his heart, a reminder of the life he had devoted to his son, of the love he still carried. The other residents noticed the change in him. They saw him writing by the window each morning, a gentle smile on his face as he lost himself in memories. Linda, the nurse, would occasionally sit with him, asking about his stories, encouraging him to share them with the others. He found himself talking about Michael more than he had in years, sharing tales of his son's accomplishments, his dreams, and the pride he still felt, despite everything. But as the journal filled, so did George's realization that his own story might be ending here, in this quiet, forgotten place. He could feel his body growing weaker, his energy fading with each passing day. And though he tried to keep his spirits up, the loneliness grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting in from the common area, George felt a sudden, overwhelming sadness. He opened the notebook to a blank page, his hand trembling as he began to write a letter to Michael. It was a letter filled with words he had never spoken aloud, feelings he had kept buried deep within him. He told Michael about the love he had for him, about the sacrifices he had made, the dreams he had put aside to ensure that Michael would have every opportunity in life. He wrote about his regret, his sorrow over the distance that had grown between them. He confessed his hope that, someday, Michael would understand just how much he meant to him, that he would realize the depth of his father's love. The words flowed from him, unfiltered and raw, each line a piece of his heart laid bare on the page. As he finished the letter, George folded it carefully and placed it between the pages of the notebook. He hoped that somehow it would reach Michael, that his son would one day read it and know the truth of his father's love. It was his last gift, a final attempt to bridge the gap between them, to leave behind something that might bring them closer, even if he wouldn't be there to see it. Days passed, and George grew weaker, his health deteriorating rapidly. Linda and the other nurses noticed his decline, their hearts heavy as they cared for him, knowing that he had very few visitors, that his son had yet to come. George accepted their kindness with quiet gratitude, but each day felt emptier, the silence around him deepening as he felt his strength slipping away. One morning, Linda found George by the window, the notebook open on his lap, his gaze distant. She approached him gently, asking if he would like her to read some of his stories aloud. George smiled, nodding, his voice barely a whisper, as he told her about the letter he had written to Michael. Maybe one day he'll read it, he said, his eyes misty with a mixture of hope and resignation. As George's health continued to decline, the atmosphere in the nursing home grew somber. The staff, especially Linda, took extra care to make him comfortable, sensing that he was nearing the end of his journey. Linda often sat by his bedside, reading aloud from his journal, sharing his memories, and listening to his stories. George would close his eyes as she read, a faint smile on his face as he revisited the precious moments he had documented. In those moments, it was as though he was reliving his life, one cherished memory at a time. Meanwhile, Michael was caught up in his fast-paced life, unaware of the rapid changes in his father's health. The calls from the nursing home staff went unanswered, with each message from Linda explaining George's condition brushed aside in the endless shuffle of meetings and appointments. Michael felt a lingering guilt each time he heard one of those messages, but he buried it under excuses, convincing himself that he would visit when he had more time. But the weeks passed, and Michael's promised visit remained just that, a promise left unfulfilled. One afternoon, Linda made one final attempt. She called Michael's office, her voice calm yet firm, urging him to come as soon as possible, explaining that his father's time was running out. Something in her tone finally pierced through the walls Michael had built around himself. He felt a sudden chill, a hollow ache in his chest as he listened to Linda's words. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about his father, not as an obligation, but as the man who had raised him, who had given up everything to ensure his success. Michael cleared his schedule, his mind racing as he made his way to the nursing home. A strange heaviness filled him, a gnawing feeling of regret and dread. He thought about the last time he had seen his father, the look of sadness in George's eyes as he had left him there. It was a look he had pushed aside, buried under the demands of his life, but now it haunted him, resurfacing with painful clarity. When he arrived at the nursing home, the atmosphere felt different, subdued and heavy, with the weight of quiet grief. Linda met him in the hallway, her expression solemn as she led him to George's room. As they walked, she told him about George's final days, about how he had spent his time writing down his memories, filling the pages of his journal with the life he had shared with Michael. She mentioned the letter, tucked between the pages, the words George had written in hopes that his son would one day understand the depth of his love. Michael felt his throat tighten as they reached George's room. He hesitated at the door, a flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face the reality of his choices, to confront the consequences of the distance he had allowed to grow between them. But when he stepped inside, his heart sank at the sight of his father, lying still and frail, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Linda gently placed the journal in Michael's hands. "He wanted you to have this," she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with an unspoken urgency. "He filled it with stories of you, of the life he built for you. And there's a letter, something he wanted you to read." Michael sat by his father's bedside, the journal resting heavily in his lap. He opened it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, each word carrying a piece of George's love, his memories, his sacrifices. Page after page, Michael read of the life his father had dedicated to him, of the nights George had stayed awake, worrying about his future, celebrating his achievements from afar, and hoping that Michael would find happiness. As he turned the pages, Michael found the letter George had written. His hands shook as he unfolded it, his vision blurred by tears he could no longer hold back. The letter was filled with words George had never spoken aloud, words of love and forgiveness, a final message to the son he had cherished above all else. Michael, the letter began, I know life has taken you far from where we started, and I am proud of all you have achieved. I never wanted to be a burden to you, only a guide, a steady presence in your life. If my love ever felt like a weight to you, I am sorry. All I ever wanted was for you to live the life I could only dream of. Michael's breath caught as he continued to read, each line cutting deeper, a testament to a love he had taken for granted. I may not be here for much longer, but remember that I am with you, always, in every lesson, in every sacrifice, in every quiet moment we shared. My love for you is eternal, my dear son, and I hope that someday you will understand just how much you mean to me. The letter ended with a simple wish. Be kind to yourself, and remember that family is all we truly have. Michael clutched the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking as he finally let himself feel the weight of his choices, the regret he had buried for so long. He reached for George's hand, his fingers trembling as he held it gently, feeling the warmth that remained, a fragile link to the man who had loved him unconditionally. I'm so sorry, Dad, he whispered, his voice choked with tears. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry for leaving you here. In that quiet moment, Michael felt the full impact of his father's absence, the emptiness left by a lifetime of love he had never truly appreciated. He stayed by George's side, holding his hand, whispering words of apology and love, hoping that somehow his father could hear him, that he could feel the depth of his remorse. Linda watched from the doorway, her heart heavy yet hopeful, as Michael finally embraced the truth of his father's legacy. In the silence of that room, surrounded by George's memories and the weight of his love, Michael vowed to honor his father's memory, to carry forward the lessons he had learned too late. He knew that nothing could change the past, but he could shape the future, guided by the values George had instilled in him, the love he had left behind. As the night fell, Michael sat alone in his father's room, the journal open before him, the letter clutched in his hands. In those final quiet hours, he found a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, a connection to his father that transcended the distance that had once separated them. And though George was gone, his spirit remained, a gentle presence in the heart of his son, a reminder of a love that would never fade. In the days that followed George's passing, Michael found himself returning to that journal over and over again. Each time he opened it, he discovered new memories, small fragments of a life that George had poured into raising him. He would sit by the window in his own home, the same way his father once had, reading the stories George had left behind. Every page revealed more of his father's sacrifices, his unwavering pride, and the quiet hopes he had carried for Michael's future. It was as if George were speaking to him from beyond, filling the silence with a love that Michael had been too blind to see. The weight of regret was heavy, but something else began to take root within Michael, a sense of purpose, a desire to honor the legacy his father had left him. He had spent his life chasing success, pushing aside the values his father had tried to instill in him. But now, each memory he read reminded him of the man he wanted to become, the man George had always hoped he would be. It wasn't too late to change. It wasn't too late to make amends in his own way. Inspired by the journal, Michael decided to visit the nursing home again. He wanted to meet the people who had been with his father in his final days, the staff and residents who had cared for him and shared in his life when he hadn't. It was a bittersweet visit. Each room, each hallway, brought back memories of the last time he had been there. The guilt of knowing he had left his father to rely on strangers for companionship. But it also brought a strange comfort, knowing that George had found kindness here when his own son had not been there. Linda greeted him warmly, her expression softening as she saw the change in his eyes. She led him to the common room, where some of George's friends from the nursing home sat, sharing stories and laughter. Michael introduced himself humbly, explaining who he was and expressing his gratitude for the companionship they had shown his father. One by one, they shared stories of George's time there, how he had spoken about Michael with pride, how he had kept the photo of their fishing trip on his bedside table, how he had smiled every time he mentioned his son. These stories opened Michael's eyes to a side of George he had never fully known. He listened quietly, feeling a warmth that was both comforting and heartbreaking, a sense of connection that transcended his father's absence. He realized that George had found his own family here, people who had loved and respected him when he, Michael, had been too absorbed in his own life to do the same. At the end of the visit, Michael pulled out the journal, his voice thick with emotion, as he offered it to Linda and the others. "I thought, maybe you would like to read his stories," he said. "They're filled with memories, with the life he led, and the love he had for all of you." They accepted the journal with gratitude, and Michael felt a sense of peace, knowing that his father's words would live on, bringing comfort and joy to those who had been there for him in his final days. Returning home, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. Inspired by George's sacrifices, he began making changes in his life. He stepped back from the relentless pursuit of wealth and status, focusing instead on building relationships and helping others. He started visiting nursing homes regularly, volunteering his time, sharing stories, and listening to the memories of those who, like his father, had so much to share and so few people to listen. In honor of George, Michael set up a small foundation to support the elderly, providing resources and companionship for those who had been forgotten by their families. He wanted to ensure that no one would feel as lonely as his father had, that others would find the warmth and care they deserved. Through this work, Michael found healing, a way to make amends for the time he had lost, to bring meaning to the pain of his regrets. One evening, as he sat in his quiet home, he opened the journal again, flipping to the last page. There, in George's familiar handwriting, was a final note, one he hadn't noticed before. It read simply, "Remember, my son, that love is our true legacy. It lives on in the lives we touch, in the kindness we show, in the memories we leave behind. Family isn't just those we are born to. It is those we cherish, those we care for, those we welcome into our hearts." Michael held the journal close, feeling his father's presence fill the room, a soft reassurance that George's love would remain with him, guiding him forward. Though George was gone, his legacy lived on in every act of kindness Michael performed, in the lives he touched, in the family he had chosen to build in honor of his father's memory. And for the first time, Michael understood that love wasn't something that could fade or be lost. It was a gift that grew, connecting him to his father in ways he had never imagined, a bond that would endure beyond time, beyond regret, beyond goodbye. As time went on, Michael found himself transformed by the lessons his father had left behind. George's words, recorded so carefully in that journal, became a compass for him, guiding his choices and reshaping his values. Michael no longer pursued the things that had once consumed him, the endless search for status, wealth, and recognition, felt empty compared to the fulfillment he found in simpler, more meaningful acts. Every weekend, Michael made it a ritual to visit the nursing home, the same one where his father had spent his last days. He was no longer a stranger there. The residents welcomed him with open arms, finding comfort in his presence and companionship in the hours he spent with them. He listened to their stories, laughed with them, and shared small but heartfelt moments, just as he wished he had done with George. And through these connections, Michael found pieces of his father in each person he met, a reminder that George's love and values were alive, extending through the lives he touched. One day, as Michael was leaving the nursing home, he noticed a young man sitting by himself, looking troubled and lost. One winter evening, as Michael sat by the fire in his home, he received a letter in the mail. It was from one of the young volunteers at the nursing home, someone he had met through his regular visits. The letter was filled with gratitude, thanking him for the guidance he had provided, for sharing his story, and for inspiring others to value family and relationships. The young volunteer mentioned how she had started spending more time with her own grandparents after hearing about Michael's journey with his father, realizing the importance of cherishing the time she had with them. Reading the letter brought a smile to Michael's face, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any success he had achieved in his previous life. It reminded him of his father's words, written so carefully in the journal he had left behind. Family is all we truly have. The legacy George had left him was not just one of memories, but a mission, a calling to pass forward the love he had once overlooked. Over the years, Michael collected letters and stories from others who had been touched by his foundation, individuals who had reconnected with loved ones, families who had mended old rifts, and elderly people who found companionship through the programs he had established. Each story became a testament to the power of family and forgiveness, and with each new letter, Michael felt his father's spirit guiding him, as if George were still by his side, proud and present. One spring day, as Michael was organizing some of his father's belongings, he found a small box he hadn't noticed before. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was an old pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a family heirloom passed down from father to son. George had once shown it to him as a child, telling him about its significance, but Michael had long forgotten about it. Now, holding it in his hands, he felt a deep connection to the generations that had come before him, a reminder that he was part of something greater, a lineage of love and sacrifice. Inspired by the discovery, Michael decided to pass on the heirloom. He gave the pocket watch to a young man he had mentored through his foundation, someone who had once been on the brink of losing everything due to strained family relationships. The young man, touched by the gesture, promised to keep it as a reminder of the importance of family, vowing to pass it down when the time was right. It was a symbolic gesture, one that reflected Michael's journey, a way to keep his father's spirit alive in the lives of others. As he grew older, Michael found comfort in the life he had built, a life filled with purpose, shaped by the lessons George had taught him. He continued to honor his father's memory, not only through his actions, but through the stories he shared, the people he helped, and the connections he nurtured. George's love had not only changed Michael's life, but had rippled outward, touching countless others, a legacy of kindness and compassion that endured beyond their own lives. In his final years, Michael wrote down his own reflections, recording his journey, the regrets he had carried, the lessons he had learned, and the peace he had found in honoring his father's memory. He left these writings for those who would come after him, a gift to the next generation, hoping they would understand the importance of family, of forgiveness, of cherishing the people we love before it's too late. When Michael's time came, he passed peacefully, surrounded by friends and family, many of whom had been touched by his life's work. And in his final moments, as he held his own child's hand, he felt a warmth fill him, a comforting presence that seemed to whisper words of encouragement and pride. He knew, deep within his heart, that George was with him, welcoming him with open arms, their bond as strong as ever, a love that had transcended time and space. Michael's story, his father's story, and the lessons they left behind lived on in the hearts of those who remembered them. Their lives had become intertwined in a legacy of compassion and forgiveness, a reminder that even in the face of regret and loss, love endures, growing stronger with each person it touches, each life it transforms. And so, George's legacy continued, an unbroken thread of love that spanned generations, leaving behind a testament to the power of family, the beauty of forgiveness, and the enduring strength of a father's love.